The opiate of the masses. Although Karl Marx used this to describe religion of his day, little did he know that an actual opiate would soon take over: heroin. In the United States today, hearing stories of someone overdosing while driving or walking down the street is not just common, it's the norm. But in a not too distant past, heroin had no significant grip on American society. People did use it, but not the way that they do today. The reason for this increased usage can ironically be traced back to doctors' offices. During the 1990s and into the 2000s, many physicians overprescribed painkillers to their patients, causing them to become addicted to their pills. But once their prescriptions ended, the patients just couldn't get enough. They needed something to take away their pain, take away their anxiety, and take away their feelings. It's because of this that many of them turned to heroin. Unfortunately, heroin is one of the most destructive drugs on the streets today. Addicts destroy their bodies by taking it over and over again. But they can only take it over and over again, however, until they overdose. Their breathing stops. Oxygen can't reach their brain if only there were some way to save them. Thankfully, in the age of modern medicine, there is a way: Narcan. In the case of an overdose on heroin, this drug can bring a victim back to life in seconds. Now, it's one thing to hear about this, but it's a completely different thing to see. This video from Boston details real-time action from medics equipped with Narcan and shows Narcan's saving abilities.
The call comes in for an erratic driver in Chinatown. A man in that white SUV will not stop for police. At one point, it looks like he might ram the officer's squad. Confronting that threat, the officer jumps out with his gun drawn. You don't hear him, but it's clear that man is screaming at the officer as he thrashes around violently in his car. But that officer is incredibly calm as he tries to diffuse his anger. Eventually, backup arrives, and it becomes clearer the man is suffering an apparent overdose. A team of officers pull him out of the car, his seemingly lifeless body slumped on the pavement. But Captain Kelly McCormick is holding his head as he massages his chest. Another officer grabs the Narcan to breathe life into the man who is now unconscious. It takes 2 doses. And that audible sigh of revival brings officers tremendous relief.
It just saved his life.
EMTs take the man away for further treatment, and those officers who saved his life regroup after a tense traffic stop that ended with a heroic save. Certainly.
So without this medicine, that man would have died on the spot in the street. Because of its quick, life-saving abilities, cities and their EMTs all across America carry Narcan. But just as the popularity of heroin has increased, so has the demand for this life-saving drug. Because of this, cities have to buy more and more Narcan. Simply put, Narcan is not free, and cities all across the United States have started having trouble affording it. This is exactly why some have proposed a new solution to take care of those who overdose on heroin multiple times: let them die. This specific solution has been coined the 3 strikes policy, stating that municipalities will revive someone with Narcan only twice, and on the 3rd time, they will let them die. As Christians, we should not simply watch heroin addicts die all across our communities due to the 3 strikes policy, but rather we should use whatever means God has given us to help save their lives and help cure their disease. Through this presentation, I will first define heroin, addiction, and Narcan. Secondly, I will discuss the controversial law proposed in Ohio and its implications. And finally, I'll present the alternatives to simply letting heroin addicts die or throwing them in jail. So before even beginning to unload this complicated issue, we have to first know what heroin is. As defined by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, heroin, quote, is an opioid drug made from morphine, a natural substance taken from the seed pod of the various opium poppy plants grown in Southeast and Southwest Asia, Mexico, and Colombia, end quote. And it should be noted that an opioid essentially is just a drug that acts on the nervous system to relieve pain. It distracts the brain from the pain. Now, something unique about heroin is its versatility. Addicts can inject, sniff, and smoke it. And some even mix it with cocaine for an even more powerful high. Along with this versatility comes its speed. It arrives quickly to the brain and, quote, binds to opioid receptors on cells located in many areas, especially those involved in feelings of pain and pleasure, and in controlling heart rate, sleeping, and breathing, end quote. So this relief and pleasure begins the cycle of addiction. And as the addiction gets worse, their tolerance to the drug builds, causing them to go to extreme measures just for a high. So the cycle continues, and the addiction gets worse. But what actually is addiction, and why is it harmful? Addiction essentially is a binding condition where your brain and your thoughts constantly revolve around something that gives them pleasure. In this case, heroin. A healthy brain rewards healthy behaviors, such as eating healthy, exercising, or bonding with another person. Your brain turns on special circuits and releases certain hormones as to cause you to want to repeat these behaviors over and over again. But on the opposite end of the spectrum, when in a dangerous situation, your brain turns on other special circuits and releases other special hormones as to want to avoid the situation. It causes fear and alarm. Your front brain decides whether the potential consequences are worth it. The National Institute of Health weighs in on this specific topic in their article titled Biology of Addiction, stating, quote, drugs or alcohol can hijack the pleasure reward circuits in the brain and hook you into wanting more and more. Addiction can also send your emotional danger sensing circuits into overdrive, making you feel anxious or stressed even when you're not using the drugs or alcohol. At this stage, people often use the drugs or alcohol to keep from feeling bad rather than for their pleasurable effects, end quote. So as the addiction gets worse, addicts lose their self-control. They risk losing relationships, losing their jobs, but ultimately losing their own lives. But the biology behind addiction reveals why more than just good intentions or willpower are needed to break it. We all enjoy sugary sweets and desserts, but you don't read the newspaper and hear that someone overdosed on Twinkies or something like that. Heroin works in a completely different way. Dr. George Koob, director of the National Institute of Health Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, says that, quote, a common misperception is that addiction is a choice or moral problem, and that all you have to do is stop. But nothing could be further from the truth. The brain actually changes with addiction, and it takes a good deal of work to get it back to its normal state. The more drugs or alcohol you've taken, the more disruptive it is to the brain, end quote. So of course, when you're addicted to heroin, it disrupts the reward circuits and hormones in your body, causing you to be in a state of constant anxiety even when you're not using it. And I believe that this is one of the biggest misconceptions about addiction. Some might call them weak-minded, or others might view them as lesser human beings because they simply can't control their desires. But this doesn't solve the issue. It simply adds more fuel to the fire. Addiction can only be properly treated when we view addicts as troubled, hurting people who need someone to care about them enough to help them out of that cycle of addiction. The National Institute of Health goes on to say, quote, repeated use of the drugs can damage the essential decision-making center at the front of the brain. This area, known as the prefrontal cortex, is the very region that should help you recognize the harms of using addictive substances, end quote. But of course, when you're addicted to heroin, this cortex is faulty, and this is why heroin addicts go to extreme measures just to get heroin. And although we tend to think of heroin addicts as adults, oftentimes they start as teenagers. The National Institute of Health says, quote, teens are especially vulnerable to possible addiction because their brains are not yet fully developed, particularly the frontal regions that help with impulse control and assessing risk. Pleasure circuits in adolescent brains also operate in overdrive, making drug and alcohol use even more rewarding and enticing, end quote. Age doesn't matter. Anyone can get hooked into heroin, hooked into the cycle of addiction, and they set themselves up for one thing, an overdose. An overdose occurs when the drug user has so much of the drug in his or her system that it causes them to slip into a state of unconsciousness. Along with the state of unconsciousness comes either slowed or non-existent breathing. In this case of slow or non-existent breathing, it can significantly decrease the amount of oxygen let into the brain, which can lead to a condition called hypoxia. The National Institute on Drug Abuse tells us, quote, that hypoxia can have short and long-term mental effects and effects on the nervous system, including coma and permanent brain damage, end quote. So as heroin addicts are in this state of near death, they creep closer to death's edge. And because of the excessive amount of overdoses in the United States, medical teams needed some way to reverse them. Thankfully, a drug called Narcan, like what I have right here, hit the scene, which revives addicts in a matter of seconds. According to the National Institute on Drug Abuse, quote, naloxone, also known as Narcan, is a medicine that can treat an opioid overdose when given right away. It works by rapidly binding to opioid receptors in the body and blocking the effects of heroin and other opioid drugs. Sometimes more than one dose may be needed to help a person start breathing again. And so Narcan essentially acts as a get-out-of-jail-free card, except that jail is death. So of course, pharmaceutical companies saw the rising amount of heroin in the United States, the usage, and they saw the rising demand for the drugs that can wake someone up from it. And they did what pharmaceutical companies often do, raise their prices. In a CNBC article by Meg Terrell concerning the cost of Narcan, Terrell said, quote, as the number of opioid overdoses has skyrocketed in the US, so has the price of the drug that can wake someone up. And in some cases, the rising prices make it hard for first responders and others to carry naloxone, which public health experts say threatens their ability to save lives, end quote. And while this goes into the morality of the steep rising costs of pharmaceutical drugs, that's a completely different debate for another time. Right now, we're focused only on Narcan. But regardless, municipalities all across the United States struggle to pay for Narcan. Middletown, Ohio, right up the road on I-75, is a perfect example of this. But one man, a city politician, proposed a drastically different solution to this problem. City Councilman Dan Picard of Middletown proposed the 3 strikes policy, which, as previously stated, would allow only 2 separate revivals for someone addicted to heroin, and on the 3rd time, they would let them die. Although Mr. Picard fought hard for his 3 strikes policy, it is grossly immoral and should not be adopted anywhere. In an interview with local news station WLWT, Mr. Picard said that he, quote, wants to send a message to the world that you don't want to come to Middletown to overdose because someone might not come with Narcan to save your life. We need to put a fear about overdosing back in Middletown, end quote. And if you look at the facts regarding heroin use in Middletown, you can see where his frustration stems from. In all of 2016, as demonstrated by the top graph, Middletown had 532 overdoses on heroin. Through just June 1st of 2017, the bottom graph, they already had over 575. Mr. Picard even said himself in an article by Newsweek that each overdose response cost the city upwards of $1,100. This obviously leaves little wiggle room financially for cities, but this argument fails to see that one side values the life of a human being and the other side values the city budget. Humans have infinite value. If someone says we're going to let another human being die, that should raise many red flags. But in order to understand why that raises many red flags, we have to go to the Bible. Beginning in the New Testament, Jesus preaches on serving our fellow man. He says in Matthew 25, verses 35 through 40, "For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. And I was sick, and you visited me. And I was in prison, and you came to me." Then the righteous will answer him, saying, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you?" And the king will answer them, saying, "Truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers, you did it to me." So Jesus doesn't say when we do it to someone who's just having a bad day or kind of down on their luck. He says that when we did it to the least of these, we did it to him. I'd say using heroin to the point of near death is close to the least of these, wouldn't you? Now this begins the overarching theme of Jesus' ministry, love. Jesus gave us a new commandment that we love one another. Just as Christ loved us, we also are to love one another. By this, all people will know that we are his disciples, if we have love for one another, as it says in John 13, verses 34 through 35. These verses convict us to love and help everyone. Now, mercy intertwines itself with this theme of love. Jesus' death on the cross demonstrates that love and mercy towards humanity. As it says in 1 John 3, 16 through 18, "By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. But if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? Little children, let us not love in word or in talk, but in deed and in truth. So I believe the key words here are in verse 17, where it talks about the world's goods. Now, although I did use ESV, the biblical translation ESV, for this presentation, many other biblical translations substitute world's goods for the term means of sustaining life. And so in this situation of heroin addicts not being revived, potentially the third time with Narcan, I would say that Narcan definitely counts as means of sustaining life, because without it, how would they be able to sustain their own lives? They wouldn't be able to. So because of this, Councilman Picard has received plenty of opposition, but most notably from the police chief of Middletown himself. Police Chief McFarland's position perfectly aligns with this 1 John passage. He states, "Some people have begun taking these casualties as a foregone conclusion. You hear from the public, why don't you let them die? We're not God. We don't decide who lives or dies. We have the ability to save them, so we do save them," end quote. Even Mr. McFarland doesn't believe that withholding Narcan the third time is the right thing to do. And even if you take the Bible out of this argument, the policy still doesn't hold up. Mr. Picard said that addicts cost the city too much money, and that they don't contribute anything to society, and that they're just drains on society. But if we have medical professionals deciding life or death based on a patient's contribution to society, that sets themselves up on a very slippery slope. What about an adult with significant mental disabilities who can't hold a job? What about an adult with extreme physical disabilities who can't live independently and has to have a caretaker come in? Where would medical professionals draw the line on this issue? We can't simply throw lives away. Each one of us bears the image of God, from the President of the United States to the heroin addict down the street, no matter how much you may not like them. So this doesn't show God's love nor his mercy, but ultimately it doesn't solve the issue. In order to solve this issue, we have to change the target of the solution. In a Newsweek article on the controversy of letting addicts die, author Ben Haller bluntly stated, "Drug addiction makes people do irrational things. Addicts are not going to ask themselves if they're within Middletown city limits before shooting up. As long as politicians and government officials continue to view the opioid epidemic as a war to be fought against drug users rather than a battle to save them, many more lives are going to be lost. Addicts need access to treatment, not ultimatums," end quote. And Ryan Ludwig, a local EMT member in Westchester who I interviewed for this presentation, concurs with this, stating, quote, "The patients need to have a new focus and something else to be addicted to. Assistance with job skills training, helping patients reclaim their own lives, and being a part of their own family and society is critical. They are our neighbors, friends, coworkers, and family members. This addiction does not know or care about socioeconomic status, race, religion, or gender. This is something that everyone needs to participate in order to find success," end quote. And so this skewed view of the war has led to a skewed solution for those saved through Narcan. Just throw them in jail. But this is not the solution. Two main solutions exist regarding this. The first would be rehabilitation through regular rehab centers. But the public's attitude must change in order to effectively address this issue. When the police might throw an addict in jail, this would satisfy many people's sense of justice. I like how Recovery First, a rehabilitation facility, addresses this issue. They say that if addiction is one of the underlying causes of drug crime, then treating it is essential. However, many people have hostile attitudes towards use of rehabilitation over incarceration. To some, rehab seems less like a punishment than prison time. Others may not understand that addiction is a neurological disease and not simply a matter of low willpower or poor character," end quote. And this is honestly how I personally viewed rehab before this presentation, considering what little knowledge I had of it. But rehab is everything but easy for them. And this is also why many people don't want tax money going towards rehabilitation centers, because they view rehabilitation as an easy punishment. In the same article from Recovery First, they contest that, quote, "Addiction treatment can be far less costly than incarceration. Recidivist drug offenders may spend years in and out of the legal system, costing the legal and penal systems thousands of dollars. In contrast, a successful inpatient rehab program lasts only a few months," end quote. So in reality, rehab can be much, much cheaper. Now, some prisons have begun their own form of rehab. the other viable solution. Methadone and Suboxone treatments have trickled into some prisons. These drugs, methadone and Suboxone, themselves are opioids, which block the effects of illicit drugs, such as heroin, reduce withdrawal symptoms from heroin, and decrease cravings from heroin. In a New York Times article on these treatments, they say, quote, "Many people, however, believe incorrectly that treatments like methadone and Suboxone, themselves opioids, allow inmates to get high and simply replace one addiction with another," end quote. But you should know that these dosages are not just given out randomly. They're individually calculated for each addict. Now, one state has begun to try this rehabilitation in prisons. Connecticut officials say that the program has shown promise and that addicts are more likely to continue treatment after release. Mr. Feliciano, a jail official in Connecticut, said, quote, "I can tell you that the climate around these people is better than it had been before. But attitudes have not completely shifted, and methadone is still viewed as a privilege," end quote. So as you can see, jail time solves nothing. True treatment must either begin in rehabilitations or in the jails themselves through jail rehabilitation. These alternatives ultimately save city money, but more importantly, stay in line with God's word. Choosing rehabilitation versus letting an addict die demonstrates the love that God has for us. Christians receive so much love and mercy from God, and it would be foolish and immoral to reserve mercy and grace for those who we deem worthy of it. That's not how God calls us to live. He tells us to serve the least of these. Each person on this planet bears the image of God, even the least of these. We must respect, cherish, and preserve human life, including the drug addicts. Cities have the world's goods or means of sustaining life. Cities have the people to save these lives, and cities should save these lives. Now, while this solves the situation from a religious standpoint, it also leads us to an answer from a political standpoint. Municipalities should not implement the three strikes policy. Throwing addicts in jail without any rehabilitation, however, cannot solve the issue either. Jails and rehabilitation centers alike must take on the responsibility of weaning heroin addicts off the drug by implementing alternative methadone and Suboxone treatments. Through Narcan and these rehabilitation options, America can finally begin to rid itself of this horrible epidemic and finally begin to cure those afflicted with the horrible disease of addiction. Thank you.